What's going on YouTube? As you may know, the Tesla Model S Plaid is capable of 200 miles an hour, but is it capable of more? In this video, we're going to deep dive into the numbers and we're going to see just what speed the Model S Plaid powertrain is capable of. Before we get into theoretical top speeds, let's look at the current Model S Plaid. So we know with the 21-inch wheel setup, the front tires are 265 width and the rear tires are 295 width. It's 35 aspect ratio in the front, 30 in the rear. That's bringing the rear tire diameter to 28 inches and the front tire diameter to 28.3 inches. If we convert this to revolutions per mile, we get about 712 in the front and 721 revolutions per mile in the rear. Okay, so the reason I put these numbers on the screen is to calculate how many RPMs the motors are spinning at its peak speed of 200 miles an hour. So the first thing we're going to do is calculate the wheel speed at 200 miles an hour. That's how many revolutions per minute the wheels are actually spinning. RPMs, same measure as the motors, it's just going to be at the wheels. So if we take 200 miles an hour and we divide by 60, because there's 60 minutes in an hour, and then we multiply by our revolutions per mile, we get 200 divided by 60 multiplied by 721, and that's equal to 2,404 rotations per minute of the wheels themselves. So since we know the rotation rate of the wheels, and we know the final drive ratio, which is the reduction of motor RPM to wheel RPM, we know that we can multiply that 7.56 by the RPM at the wheels, and that'll give us motor RPM. So 2404 multiplied by our final drive, 7.56, is equal to about 18,174 RPMs at its top speed of 200 miles an hour. So based on information directly from Elon Musk, we know that the Plaid motors are capable of 20,000 RPMs roughly, potentially a little bit more. So let's imagine we remove the 200 mile an hour electronic limiter, and instead of using a speed limiter, we're going to use an RPM limiter. So just like an internal combustion engine car has a red line, we're going to set a 20,000 RPM red line on these motors, and we're going to see what speed it could get up to. So what I'm about to show you guys is a drag race simulator where we have on top an unlimited Plaid and a 200 mile an hour limited version on the bottom. And it's going to be a mile simulated race, and it's taking into account a bunch of different parameters, and it's using the exact same math we just went through for the gearing and the actual tire calculations. So let's see what an unlimited versus limited version looks like, and let's see what speed we can hit with that 20,000 RPM red line, we're going to call it. Okay, so this simulation is going to be a mile long from a dig. And the cars are the exact same, just the one on top does not have a speed limiter. It instead has an RPM limiter of 20,000. So we can see they're accelerating at the exact same rate. And the normal version is going to actually hit its limiter at about 17 seconds. So we can see that it's at 200 miles an hour here on the right with zero acceleration, motor spinning at 18,176 RPM. And if we resume here, we can see that the unlimited version is still accelerating. And right before the finish, if we go back a couple frames, it stopped accelerating at 223 miles an hour. So it's showing 20,242 RPM here because that's going to be the rear motor speed. The front motor speed is going to be right at 20,000 RPMs at 223 miles an hour. And the reason why they're at different RPMs is because the diameter of the front and rear tires is actually different, which is changing the gearing overall. So if you ripped off that speed limiter and instead had that hard 20,000 RPM limit, it would be capable of about 220 miles an hour. So that's cool, but now we're limited by RPM. So if we have that 20,000 RPM limit, is there any way we can go faster? And the answer is yes. If you're one step ahead of me, you're thinking, well, let's change the gearing. If we change the gearing, it'll give us more RPMs to work with, which will give us a chance to reach a much higher top speed. If we jump back to the simulation where I paused last time, you can see that the unlimited version on top, it's only outputting 385 kilowatts to go 223 miles an hour. So we know this car is capable of 750 kilowatts of output to its peak 20,000 RPM red line. And so this car has much more in the tank. If it was geared properly, it could actually go much faster. Before we start playing around with gearing, I want to see how fast this Plaid is capable of going based on its aerodynamic drag and rolling resistance. And so I've done a really simplified version, but you can see it on the screen here. We're going to use the air resistance and power equations to come up with a really simple equation, which is going to tell us how much power you need to go a certain speed. So we input the coefficient of drag of the Model S Plaid, air density 1.22, and the frontal area of the car. And we know that we have 1,020 horsepower, which is equivalent to 760 kilowatts. And we come up with V cubed is equal to 2.6 million watts roughly, which is giving us a velocity of 136.8 meters per second, which is 306 miles an hour. However, this doesn't include rolling resistance. So I have a ton of other videos that calculate rolling resistance, but you'll know that the rolling resistance is a much smaller component than the aerodynamic drag. So aerodynamic drag is the dominant part of this equation. And this is also assuming 100% powertrain efficiency. We know that the Model S Plaid isn't making 1,020 horsepower at the wheels, although it is more than you'd think. It's not like a traditional ICE car that's going to lose about 15%. The number's probably in the single digits. Okay, so we're back in the simulator. We're going to figure out how fast this car is capable of going. So the simulator's taking into account rolling resistance, which I didn't go through, and aerodynamic drag of the car, and it's also taking into account drivetrain loss. So the drivetrain loss that the simulator is using on the Model S Plaid is 93% efficiency or 7% loss, and that's going to be with 1,020 horsepower output. So I've changed the gearing on the unlimited version, and I've changed the final drive to 6 in the front and rear. And let's see just how fast this thing's capable of going. So we have the modified geared version on the top and the base version on the bottom, the stock as we see it today in real life. And we can see, if we pause it real quick here, this is a really long race, so these cars look really tiny. The base version got off the line much harder because that final drive is giving it much more wheel torque. And so that's one kind of trade-off that you have to talk about when you change gearing is, do you still have enough wheel torque to maximize acceleration, or do you want more top speed? And that's why Tesla and other companies like Rivian and Lucid have to make these trade-offs between acceleration and top speed. And that's where the final drive ratio becomes extremely important. And while I'm blabbering on here, I'll pause it. You can see that the unlimited version is going 244 miles an hour easily, and it's only turning 17,500 RPMs, while it's already passed the limited version, which is doing its 18,000 RPM limit, which we've calculated at the beginning of the video. And if we resume here, we can see that it's still pulling past 250 miles an hour, and it's starting to slow down a bit, but it's approaching that 20,000 RPM limit. And if we let it play out here, I'll skip ahead a little bit. Okay, so you can see now that it's doing 274 miles an hour, and it's still just accelerating a tiny bit. And if you let this play out, this thing can actually hit 280 miles an hour with that 6 final drive ratio. So as you can see on my screen here, 0 to 60 times, 0 to 100 times, etc. are all affected because the wheel torque does come down. You can see the final drive ratio, 6 in the rear, 6 in the front. Everything else was kept exactly the same. So the car is just stock like a Model S Plaid. All we changed was the gearing, and it reached 280 miles an hour top speed. Obviously, there's real world factors like tire limitations and cooling issues that I'm not going to talk about. This is just theoretical, looking at the gearing, power, aerodynamic drag of the car, and seeing how fast the actual Model S Plaid is capable of. So this is a cool experiment. I hope you found some value in this video. Maybe you learned something. If you did, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.